On behalf of the National Archives, on behalf of the National Archives and David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater and to today's program, Brown at 60. I'm Jim Gardner, Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and Museum Services here at the Archives. In addition to welcoming you this morning, I've also been asked to remind you to silence your phones or other devices. I see some of you reaching for them, so I hope you will all do that so that we won't have that interruption. The National Archives is very pleased to be hosting today's event in collaboration with the American Civil Liberties Union and the Archives Afro-American History Society, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Supreme Court's landmark 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education. Today's Brown at 60 program will ask, is full equality within our grasp? And will address zero tolerance, segregation, and the promise of justice, focusing on what should be our national commitment to equal educational opportunity and access. Many of our Black and Latino students and students with special needs continue to be marginalized and denied access to education. They are instead isolated, punished, or pushed into the correctional system. Today's program is spurred in part to underscore the ACLU's efforts to stem the school-to-prison pipeline and to guide our steps to inspire action and hope. To lead today's conversation, we are honored to have here leaders of the ACLU and representatives from the Department of Education. As the nation's record keeper, the National Archives is committed to engaging the public in the struggle for rights. In the Records of Rights exhibition in the David M. Rubenstein Gallery upstairs, we explore the continuing challenge of making real the ideals articulated in the Charters of Freedom, but still contested today. We believe the 60th anniversary is not just a moment to remember the past, it's a time to renew the promise for racial justice. If we are to fully realize our nation's ideals of democracy, we must reflect, recommit, and renew the promise of Brown to transform our educational system so that every child has an equal chance to thrive. As a mission of the National Archives, it is our goal to help citizens claim the rights, hold their government accountable, and understand their history so that they can participate more effectively in the government. Now it's my honor to introduce Lisha Penn. Lisha is a supervisory archivist in our Office of Research Services. She manages the staff and the pull and refile activities for the Textual Research Room at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Lisha serves as the president of our Afro-American History Society and one of the partners in today's program. Lisha.
Thank you, Jim. 10 years ago, the Afro-American History Society commemorated the 50th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court case with special programming. We are very honored today to join the American Civil Liberties Union, the Afro-American newspapers, in observing the 60th anniversary of that historic landmark decision. The Afro-American History Society is entering its 34th year as a recognized and valued staff organization at the National Archives. It originated in the 1970s as a chapter of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1915 as a national organization for the study of Black history. The founding members of this ASALH chapter at the National Archives were concerned that too few writers and scholars, and especially members of the general public, knew or understood the extent and value of records relating to Black history in the holdings of the National Archives. It was believed that affiliation with ACLU, a highly regarded professional organization devoted to Black studies, would bring a wider national and international attention to these underused federal records. Nevertheless, a decision was later made to end its affiliation with ACLU, and National Archives employee then created the Afro-American History Society in March 1980. Its objectives were the promotion, collection, study, and dissemination of historical information relating to the history, culture, and contributions of Black Americans to American history, life, and particularly as reflected in the holdings of the National Archives. The Society presents films, lectures in celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, Black History Month, and Women's History Month, which are open to the National Archives staff and the general public. Our programs feature presenters who have used NAR records in their research, such as historians Benjamin Quarles, Ira Berlin, and the late John Hope Franklin, and noted documentary filmmaker Bill Miles, the producer of such film classics as I Remember Harlem, Men of Bronze, and The Liberators. We also feature programs that are given by National Archives staff members, such as our recent Black History Month program this past February 2014 with Vera F. Williams, who is a direct descendant of Solomon Northup, who was depicted in the Hollywood film 12 Years a Slave. As the nation's record keeper, the National Archives holds many federal records relating to Brown versus the Board of Education case and the other 4 cases that made up this historic lawsuit. These cases were heard before the U.S. District Courts and Circuit Courts, the U.S. Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court. In addition, there are relevant records that may be found in NARA's Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson presidential libraries. Researchers and other members of the public who are interested in accessing these records will find NARA's reference information paper 112, Federal Records Pertaining to Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954, useful in identifying the 52 cases related to the Brown case. This finding aid was compiled in 2004 by archivist Dr. Chiquita Chestnut and the late Dr. Walter B. Hill. And it's now my honor to introduce Mr. Anthony Romero, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Anthony D. Romero is the Executive Director of the ACLU and the nation's premier defender of the liberty and individual freedom. As an attorney with a history of public-related activism, Romero has presided over the most successful membership growth in ACLU's history and a large increase in national and affiliate staff. This extraordinary growth has allowed the ACLU to expand its nationwide litigation, lobbying, advocacy, and public education programs. Romero is the ACLU's 6th executive director and his first Latino and openly gay man to serve in that capacity. Born in New York City to parents who hail from Puerto Rico, Romero is the first in his family to graduate from high school. He is a graduate of Stanford University's Law School and Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy and International Affairs. I present to you Mr. Anthony D. Romero.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be a part of a moment that we celebrate the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Anniversaries and celebrations are important not just to mark that moment in history in the past, but to mark that moment in the present about where we go in the future. Brown was that pivotal moment when ours became a more perfect union. the work of many advocates over many decades crystallized in that decision in 1954, led by the NAACP and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, with Thurgood Marshall arguing that case in the well of the Supreme Court. We at the ACLU were proud to be a part of that litigation, in an amicus brief, but also in years previous to that, in some of the cases that we had brought to lay the groundwork for the Brown victory. Some of our earliest cases represented the Scottsboro boys, who were unjustly accused of raping a white woman in the Deep South. It was that moment when we understood the critical nature that civil rights of African Americans and other minorities was deeply connected to the civil liberties of all Americans. But celebrations are more than just a moment to rest on laurels and to take a moment to just celebrate the past. They're a moment to remark where we go going forward. In 1954, the problems of racial discrimination were explicit. Today, we know through our work in this room that they're much more subtle and structural. The Supreme Court in Brown may have put an end to de jure segregation, but today we find our schools often as segregated and as hostile to young people of color, the disabled, as ever before. And in particular, we want to shed a light as we mark the celebration of Brown and redouble our efforts to bring ours to a moment of being a more perfect union by focusing on the school-to-prison pipeline, whose effects are having ruinous consequences on our nation's children. So if you haven't heard about the school-to-prison pipeline, we're here to help shed a light on that phenomenon. Let me show you, through this video I want to introduce, what life can be like for so many of our nation's kids, especially those who are poor, minority, or disabled. Watch this video with me for a second.
You ready? Okay.
My name is Kyle Thompson. I like playing football, playing video games, hanging out with my friends.
The vice principal said if I had a school full of kids like yours, I'd be the happiest man in the district.
Kyle's a very sensitive kid. I mean, he's fun to coach, he's fun to be around.
For somebody with his personality to get in this kind of trouble is so shocking to me. I didn't see it coming. I could never have imagined this.
Just on face value, I find it hard to believe.
I had a list in my bag, and it was titled Hit List, but it wasn't really to hurt anybody. And my friend took it out of my notebook. I saw him take it out, so I took it back from him. And my teacher came over, and she took it from me. And I got up and I grabbed the paper, and we were pulling it back and forth.
All the witness statements said the teacher was laughing, the teacher was playing, we were all laughing, we were all playing.
When we were pulling it back and forth, she was laughing at first, so I thought it was just as a joke, but she got serious and I let go. And then she left the class. And then the hall monitor came and they escorted me to the office. The principal told the police officer to take me to the police station. And the scariest part was probably being handcuffed inside of there. I felt that I deserved maybe a couple days of suspension at most, but I didn't think it was really 180 days worth of a consequence.
When there's activities up at the school he can't attend, he can't go watch his sister, he can't watch his former teammates play.
I can't play football, so really I just throw the football around with my friends, play video games, watch TV, but I don't really see my friends as much.
Here I am now, thousands of dollars later, 6-7 months down the road, and all day long when I'm gone, I worry about Kyle. My son has gotten progressively depressed. I still see remnants of like the old Kyle, but there's a sadness there and that kills me. I want him to be back in school. I need him to be in a school building around other children.
It seems like it would be pretty hard going back after being out of school for a long time, but it's something I would like to do.
Not brought us to the promised land that we once thought. Brown ended segregation by law, but sadly, segregated schools persist because of a complex web of factors rooted in our nation's long history of discrimination. The school-to-prison pipeline is part of a larger set of issues that includes the discriminatory war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, and the creation of a new Jim Crow. For more than 40 years, cynical political leaders have used the war on crime as a tool and a primary political tactic that has had devastating effects on minority communities. Our politicians, of course, don't talk in terms of limiting freedom of minority communities. That would be hard to get them elected in our country, gratefully, because of Brown. But they've manufactured an ever-increasing repressive war on crime that is creating a growing, largely minority underclass. It began in 1968 with Richard Nixon, with his campaign for president and his support for the war on crime. In the mid-1960s, with the violent close of the civil rights era, this was a barely concealed assault on the so-called activist judges of the era who advanced civil rights. It was also meant as a response to minorities who had the audacity to stand up to racism that they saw in their communities and vowed to defend themselves by any means necessary. The war on crime was part of the famous Southern strategy, where candidate Richard Nixon exploited the resentment of bigoted whites to win Republican votes in the previously solidly Democratic South. It was a strategy that was so obviously racist that years later, the chairman of the Republican National Committee would subsequently apologize to the NAACP publicly for that strategy. Lamentably for us, for the progeny of Brown, the Southern strategy worked. Nixon won. And ever since then, candidates, Republicans and Democrats alike, have upped the ante. The war on crime became the war on drugs, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, you're out. These were all strategies calibrated precisely to play on bigotry and that wreaked havoc on minority communities. Now, we know from research and national surveys that white Americans use drugs at approximately the same rate as minority Americans. In fact, young white people are more likely to sell drugs than minority youth. But 3/4 of those incarcerated on drug charges are Black or Latino. Despite the constitutional ideal of equal justice, practically speaking, being poor and minority makes you legally less equal and the system less just. The consequences are also separate and unequal for the individuals like Kyle. A minor pot bus for a white kid from Scarsdale, New York, can be a humiliating inconvenience. For a poor minority kid in the Bronx, it's often a life-changing event. That minor pot bus could lead to the loss of federally guaranteed student loans. It would make that person ineligible for government benefits. They lose the right to vote in many jurisdictions. They lose the right to live in public housing. One study found that job applicants with criminal records were half as likely to be called for a job interview as those with no criminal records. This on top of the fact that African Americans with no criminal records were already less likely to be called back than white applicants who spent a year in prison. If the criminal justice system were specifically designed to push minorities, especially Latino and Black men, back into segregation, it could hardly be more effective than the one we have today. The swelling of our jails by the mass incarceration of mostly young minority males has been an expensive tragedy for our nation, depriving millions of individuals of their ability to work, to learn, to participate in our democracy, and draining billions of dollars in public funds that could be used for the public good. Now, in the spirit of Brown, we also note that times are changing, that the optimism of Brown is still alive in the political climate today. In 1992, we had Newt Gingrich, who told the New York Times that we needed to build enough prisons, quote, so that there are enough beds that every violent criminal in America is locked up, and they will serve real time, and they will serve their full sentence, and they do not get out on good behavior, end quote. Mr. Gingrich, 9 years later, told the Washington Post, quote, from the same man, "There's an urgent need to address the astronomical growth in the prison population. With its huge cost in dollars and loss of human potential, the criminal justice system is broken, and conservatives must lead the way in fixing it," end quote. Amen. That's progress. That's the progress of Brown. Today, the ACLU is proud to be working with conservatives and liberals alike. Individuals like Newt Gingrich, Jeb Bush, Grover Norquist, David Keene, and others in the conservative community to work toward reforms that will cut our prison population by over 50% over the next 10 years. That is our goal that we share with our sister organizations. And for a change, we have the son of Brown in the Oval Office who is an ally with us. Last year, President Obama commuted the life sentences of 8 individuals imprisoned for nonviolent drug offenses, 4 of whom were profiled in an ACLU report entitled A Living Death. One of the individuals we profiled in our report, Clarence Aaron, was a college student who played a minor role in 2 drug deals that ended up with 3 lifetime sentences. Another is Craig Cecil. He was also profiled in a report and still remains behind bars. Craig is a father of 2 who owned a truck repair business. When he went to retrieve a truck that had been abandoned after transporting marijuana, Craig was arrested along with 20 co-conspirators, despite the fact that they didn't buy, sell, possess, or even use marijuana. On advice from his incompetent attorney, Craig took a plea that required him to testify against other conspirators. It turned out he couldn't deliver the goods. None of them were part of the conspiracy. He wasn't part of the conspiracy and couldn't give the details that was part of the plea bargain. But when he tried to withdraw from the plea deal, the federal judge forbade it. While the other conspirators got between 5 and 10 years, Craig got life without parole. And because of the bargain that he was struck with, he can't appeal. Today, this loving father, who still speaks weekly with his daughters, who were 14 and 10 at the time when he was incarcerated, tells us in our report, "I hope to die sooner rather than later." Now, that's not the promise of Brown. That's not our America. But we know that the emotion that he feels is similar to that of thousands of Americans who are unjustly incarcerated across the country. And in keeping with the spirit of Brown, we must then redouble our efforts to uproot injustice wherever we find it. We have allies in the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, James Cole, who asked the New York Bar Association for help in identifying more low-level, nonviolent offenders with clean prison records facing life behind bars and whose sentences might be commuted. Commuting sentences is an important first step but they are not the complete answer. We have to stop the excessive policing and sentencing in the first place. We have to stop treating young men like Kyle, not like students, but like potential criminals. And we have hope. We have the hope because we've seen history in our lifetimes. 60 is a very short period of time. I say that as a 49-year-old who quickly approaches it. And what we've accomplished in this country in 60 short years is nothing short of miraculous. Ours is a great nation that has the promise of truly tapping into the full human potential that is innate and God-given to each of us. At the ACLU, we're finding ways to make good on that promise. We are exploring new strategies, new tactics, new faces of the same old injustice that we have confronted as a nation for too long. Here to talk to you a little bit more and to introduce our panel that will delve into the issues of the school-to-prison pipeline and the promise of Brown as we redouble our efforts is Laura W. Murphy, the director of our Washington Legislative Office. Laura is one of the great champions of justice, not just of African Americans, but for all people in this nation. We call her one of our national treasures, and if this country didn't need her as much as they do, she would be here in the National Archives right next to the Declaration of Independence. But luckily for us, she's alive and well and a fabric of our great experiment, realizing the promise of Brown. I give you Laura Murphy.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Anthony. I noticed that you didn't say what you were saying in the reception, which is that I'm your boss, because, you didn't go that far, but I'm not going to, take issue with that. I'm not going to put you on probation or make you work from home or have you turn over your keys to Elaine Jones. But thank you for that kind introduction. You've helped us frame the key question, is full equality within our grasp? Is full educational equality within our grasp? Before we get to the introductions, though, I have to thank two people. One is Jake Oliver, who is publisher and CEO of the Afro-American newspapers. Jake, where are you? And Benjamin Phillips, who is president of the Afro-American newspapers. They have agreed to be our media sponsors, not because they're my cousins, but because Gwen McKinney asked them. As we consider the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education this afternoon, the work yet to be accomplished, we are fortunate to have two experts with us who focus on racial justice and educational opportunity. They will help us lead the discussion. Catherine Lhamon and Dennis Parker. Catherine Lhamon is the first Assistant Secretary for the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. She has achieved many career distinctions, not only in her current job, but also being one of California's foremost civil rights attorneys. She was influenced, like many of us, by her parents, and she chose law as a career to make a difference. She worked as director of high-impact litigation at the nation's largest pro bono law firm, Public Counsel, in Los Angeles, and for nearly a decade, she served as the assistant legal director of the ACLU of Southern California. Please welcome Assistant Secretary Catherine Lhamon. Catherine will be joined by Dennis Parker, who is director of the ACLU's Racial Justice Program and a dear colleague. Before joining the ACLU, Dennis was the chief of the Civil Rights Bureau in the office of the New York State Attorney General. He is a tireless advocate, and he's a dear, dear colleague. Dennis also spent 14 years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. and he has litigated some of the nation's most significant post-Brown educational equity cases. At the ACLU, Dennis leads a range of civil rights priorities and issue areas. Among them are ending racial profiling, advancing educational opportunity, and addressing the discriminatory practices of the mortgage lending industry. He also leads our campaign to halt the school-to-prison pipeline. Let's welcome Dennis Parker. So, this is a conversation, and I'm inviting everyone in the auditorium to participate, and to those who are watching us online at aclu.org/brown@60, spell out the AT, 60. And for our auditorium guests, we will have microphones available and open as soon as we get through with some initial questions. So please think of questions as we're going along. But just to get us started, I want you to bottom line it for us. 60 years after Brown, where are we? Are we making progress? Are we going backwards? Or are we standing still? Catherine?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that I'm an optimist. I think you have to be a civil rights lawyer. So I have to answer that we're making progress. I think we've made not as much progress as Brown promised us that we would, not as much progress as our children deserve. And so the road in front of us is long and hard, and we need to be one foot at a time in fighting to make sure that we actually do deliver that promise. But schools are not segregated by law today. They were segregated by law 60 years ago. We really can't say too much about what difference that makes. My mother was 10 years old when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and she attended then racially segregated schools in Richmond, Virginia. And she attended racially segregated schools for the following years after Brown versus Board of Education was decided also, because we didn't make progress in actually beginning to change the schools. But the decision itself changed the trajectory of her life, and certainly changed my life and my children's life. I did not attend racially segregated schools. My children do not today attend racially segregated schools. And I think we can't say enough about what a difference it makes for us as a people, as a country, for the highest court in the land to say that it is unlawful to live in the circumstances that my mother then lived in with respect to school, but with respect to every other choice that she made. She didn't have to drink at colored water fountains anymore. She could try on a hat in a department store. She didn't have to ride the back of the bus. And I grew up, my children grew up in a time when we don't have those same settled expectations about the dailiness of our lives and what our experiences will be. At the same time that that's true, and that's an enormous change in a very short period of time, at the same time that that's true, I am really dismayed about the volume of investigations that I now engage in that have the very same problems that we litigated and won in Brown, and that suffer the very same kinds of very distinct messages for our kids about their low value. And sometimes they're literally identical. You know, we investigated a district that, this is now 10 years ago, but we investigated a district that operated under court order that explicitly said as part of its order that the district could not require black students to sit on the back of the bus, which is dismaying in itself that the order had to say that. But when we investigated, the district was requiring black students to sit on the back of the bus, and this was in the 2000s. And you know, we had to remind them of the order that they currently were supposed to be operating under, and that they had to actually satisfy that fundamental term that the kids actually could sit anywhere they wanted on the bus. So you know, we haven't made enough progress. That's appalling to me, that's something that we have to litigate now, and that's something that our kids still suffer. It's appalling to me that we are still looking at school discipline investigations, and I say still because when I've gone back through our desegregation files at the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, the orders and the plans that we were enforcing included questions about school discipline and disparate school discipline.
Yeah, I want you though to talk about, you know, forward-looking, what you want and see for the department. But I also want to give Dennis a chance to jump in.
So forward-looking, the 30 seconds, and I'll say more, but the 30 seconds forward-looking is that we will get there, and partly we'll get there because I'm insistent that we will, and that's my mission. We will deliver for every kid who comes to us, who lets us know about the circumstances of his or her schooling that needs to be changed, and we are engaged in aggressive, robust resolutions that do change the circumstances of those kids' lives, and we're sending a message across the nation about how much in business we are and how serious we are about delivering the promise of Brown and of our federal civil rights laws.
Quickly, Dennis.
This is a different country than it was 60 years ago, and I think it's important, even though we do have to look forward, to recognize how important the history is, to recognize that we had a country with a system of apartheid that was as severe as in any place in the world, and that because of the work of brave individual plaintiffs, of incredible lawyers, and there are many amazing people in this room, but I'd be remiss if I didn't point out Ms. Jones, Elaine Jones, who is with us, who led the Legal Defense Fund, was a big voice in making significant changes. And as a result of those changes, that system of apartheid was ended, or at least the legal part of it. But as Catherine says, the fact is there are still too many barriers to opportunity for children of color. Anthony mentioned the criminal justice system, and in fact, everything that happens in the criminal justice system has a precursor in the education system. Mm-hmm. Things that push children out of schools, things that result in their being suspended more, expelled more, referred more to the police. So that in our day-to-day work, we see it's common for children to be sent to a police station for things that, when I was in school, would have resulted in perhaps detention or being sent to the principal's office. And the losses are severe. Anthony talked about them, or the consequences of involvement in the criminal justice system. We see so many ways, and I was particularly struck by what Catherine was talking about stigma. I mean, the interesting thing about Brown is it recognized the lie of Plessy versus Ferguson, that the system of separate but equal was, in fact, a pure fiction. And even though that was removed, I think that there's still stigma. Mm-hmm. When we look at discipline records, what we find is that African American kids are punished far more than white kids, but they're also punished for different things. Things like disrespect or insubordination. And I think that a lot of that comes from another kind of stigma, and a stigma that's as damaging in many ways as the stigma that Brown addressed, and that is the sense that children of color are more dangerous, are more of a threat. And I think that as long as they operate under that stigma, you're limiting their opportunities. You're limiting the chances that they're going to achieve their potential. You're limiting their ability to participate fully in American society.
Thank you, Dennis. But what I wanted to ask, in addition to the impact of Brown, is we're still in a very, very segregated society. Schools have resegregated that were once integrated. So what do we do about this persistent racial segregation? And should we really focus on that, or should we focus on educational attainment in those schools?
Well, so my view is that we need to focus on both, right? And we want all of our kids to have high quality learning environments, and I think if in fact we had delivered schools that had high expectations for the students, that were ready for all of their students, that would meet the educational desires of all the students in them, we would not see the kind of resegregation that we've seen. We would not see so many people leaving public schools, and we would see more and more families there and more communities that are more integrated, because the schools are really community centers in so much of the United States. So I think we have to be working on desegregation, and we have to be working on opportunity simultaneously. And to me, they're two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, what we know about Brown is that the goal of integrated schools was a goal of delivering the kinds of opportunities that were available to white kids for all kids, and making sure that the schools had the facilities, had the high quality teachers, had the kinds of opportunities available for all kids that had been once available only for white kids. And so, we live that same need today.
Yeah, but Dennis, in your view, why does racial segregation persist? what's at the root of this society that we can't get past skin color in education?
This is a country that was really built on racial segregation and hierarchies and discrimination, and it's hard to expect that after hundreds of years of that discrimination that it's going to change really quickly. Actually, Catherine and I just got back from an interview with Diane Reams, and there was an expert who was talking about housing segregation. And he said, oh, yeah, there's segregation, but it's all due to choice. And for me, that really illustrates what the problem is. And the problem is, in Brown, we knew exactly what we were aiming at. It was a law that said you had to separate kids on the basis of their race. That was clear. Now, so many people like this person are saying, discrimination doesn't exist anymore. And as a result, it's harder to get at the problems. We all know from our work that and from our lives that it exists. But part of the problem is to convince the country to face up with the continued existence of discrimination, to face, we do a lot of work looking at the causes of discrimination. We look at both explicit and the unconscious, implicit bias, which we all share and which we all don't face up to. And I think until we do that, until we address the systemic problems of housing and economic segregation and problems in the criminal justice system, that we can't expect that the education systems will be fair and will create opportunities for all of our students, the opportunities that they deserve.
Well, let's turn to what you've been doing at the Department of Education, because you've been doing some amazing things, Catherine, and we're all in your debt for them.
Thank you.
You've recently released data about school discipline policies that show that African American students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts for the same infractions. And it starts early. Yeah. It starts as low as pre-K.
That's right.
We're talking about 3- and 4-year-old students black students who make up 18% of the population, but 50% of the people who are suspended. Those young kids, what is going on here? And how did this get so out of control?
So it's really appalling. The numbers aren't quite 50%. I just want to say in the defense of the schools, but that's 42%. So it's 8% lower.
42.
Kids who are suspended are black students. But I say that we really can't laugh at that. It's so upsetting to me as a mom. It's so upsetting to me as the chief civil rights enforcer at the Department of Education. It's so upsetting to me as a human being that the key message that we send to our babies when they start school is that they're not valued, they're not welcome, and we don't want them in school, we're going to push them out. And I can't explain what's going on. I can't tell you what a 3-year-old could do that would justify expelling that 3-year-old from school. I can tell you ways that 3-year-olds are annoying as the mom of some little kids, but there's no way that any 3-year-old is doing anything that would justify telling that child is not welcome at school anymore. So that says to me that we have to give some tools to our teachers to let them know that there's other options in their toolbox for welcoming kids, supporting them in school, making sure that they are appropriate at school and appropriate learners, because that's something that we all want for all of our kids, right? We don't want any classrooms that are disrupted. We want our classrooms to be places where they're centers of learning. But there are lots of teachers I've spoken to who want the kids to be in school and want to support them and also want to be able to do the job that they came to do. And so want to know what is it that I can do instead. And so in addition to the kind of data that you highlight that we've put out, we've also just put out guidance together with the Department of Justice. And I can't resist saying that Anurima Bhargava, who's the chief of the Educational Opportunities section at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, is here also. And she and her office and I together put out a package of guidance for schools about what it is that we want them to do so that they understand what the law is, but also so that they understand that they have options instead of pushing kids out of school for keeping kids in school that work and that help kids to be the kind of learners that we want to support at school. So, I think that there's an education gap that causes that kind of push out, but it's also been something that we all of us are complicit in because we've been too permissive of saying, there will be zero tolerance and we want these behaviors to end.
Well, this education gap you're talking about is the education gap among school administrators, right? It's not
Yes, yes,
It's
right.
not an achievement gap that you're talking about, right?
Right, right. I think we don't have tools that are ready enough and readily available enough at the elbow for our administrators, for our teachers, so that they can be sure that they can do the job that they signed up to do, that they want to do, and that they can deliver for the kids that they're in front of.
The recency of these statistics make me wonder, Dennis, whether or not the zero tolerance policies have really landed on people as being totally and wholly inadequate for guiding school administrators.
We know that they're ineffective. We know that they started out as an overreaction to a serious concern about safety in schools, but quickly grew larger and larger and ended up in resulting too often in children being disciplined for things that were clearly not the reason they were created. You know, the child bringing the butter knife to school to spread peanut butter on their sandwich, things like that. You know, that's not an AK-47. So that we've seen so many examples where these disciplinary practices have ended up in really a mushrooming rate of children being disciplined. And the unfortunate thing is that it's not necessary. We don't think that these are the most effective places. First of all, our schools are safer now than most people think. They're actually the safest place where kids can be. And they've been getting safer over the past 20 years. But certainly, severely disciplining these children is not the answer. And we know that there are ways that you can create a positive environment in schools that reduce the likelihood of violence, that reduce the suspension and expulsion rate, and that create a safe and nurturing school environment. So it is very important that we take those steps. I want to underline the importance of the data that's available. I before I came here, went to look at my high school in New York.
It's broken down by high school, not just school districts, so that's really, really important.
And it tells you just a wide range of information, from the number of referrals to the police, to out-of-school and in-school suspensions. But it also tells you who's taking calculus. It tells you who's taking AP courses. And all of those are things that I suspect I didn't know about my school district. And when I saw it, I was extremely disappointed that it wasn't just a question of the discipline being different, but that kids of color were not taking advantage or didn't have the chance to take advantage of all of the opportunities that are available. So I would suggest that people go, when they leave here, to this website to see what's going on in their schools. And if you have these huge disparities, then maybe you need to go to the superintendent, the school board, the principal, and ask, why are we seeing this? Because this is a problem, and the great thing about having this data is it makes it clear to us that there is a problem.
You know, I went through this personally. My son was in middle school in Washington, D.C. in a public school, and 3 white kids ganged up on him, and he fought back, and they were all suspended for 2 weeks. So I called the school board and asked for an appeal process, got the runaround for 2 days, and finally the principal was overturned. But I just, you know, I was able to work in a place where that allowed me to take off time from work, and you know, it just was heartbreaking to me how much time and energy I had to spend fighting the school system, zero tolerance policies, and you know, if I had been an hourly wage worker, my goose would have been cooked.
Right.
But Catherine, tell us about the data that Dennis talked about and how we should use it and its value and its importance, and what do you hope to accomplish by making it available?
Thank you. So it's the Civil Rights Data Collection, and it's on our website at ocr.data.gov. And the collection is a picture of the equity health of all of the public schools in the 16,500 school districts in the country. And what's exciting, I think, about this most recent collection is that it's universal. So each data point is a kid. It's not a projection, it's not an estimation about what may be happening, but it represents the actual reality of what's happening to kids for all of our 49 million public school students all over the country. So it's incredibly rich, and in this administration, we've made the data public in a way that had never happened before. So it used to be that somebody who was a researcher could could FOIA to get the data and sign some agreements about how to use it because of privacy concerns, and could maybe access the data that way. And we used it internally for our enforcement work. But now, any mom, any researcher, any school principal, any superintendent, any policymaker can get that data and take a look at it and do just exactly what you described, Dennis, is take a look at your school or your district or your state, or slice it how you like, and look at a really wide variety of indicators that range from rates of teacher absence to rates of school bullying to school discipline rates, to who's offered high rigor courses in the schools, to instance of uses of restraint and seclusion in our schools. And so it's a really wide variety, and we cut them. The data is cuttable by race, by sex, by disability status, by national origin, by English learner status. And so you can really get a rich picture of what's happening. We don't know what's happening underneath the data, right? So when you see disparities, then it's the time to go and ask, is there something that we need to change at the school? Is there a reason for this? Is there something else that needs to be done? And certainly what we do, so we use it in our enforcement actions to go and find out if the federal civil rights laws are being lived up to in the schools and the districts around the country. But we're so excited about the ways that communities have made change in response to the data. The sunlight that the data has drawn has changed discipline in multiple states, in California, in Maryland, in Colorado, in Pennsylvania, in ways that we're really excited about, just from taking a look at those kinds of disparities. And people are using it to advocate for change, so that it's such an important lever for us in terms of delivering our civil rights promise for kids. It's something that we can use in addition to the enforcement stick, so that when we see those kinds of disparities, people can take change into their own hands, which we're excited about.
One of the things that aggravates me, Dennis, is that we go from name to name. We go from Jordan Davis to Trayvon Martin, yeah, to the Gina Six, and what you are talking about, what we're talking about, is institutional racism. Yes. It's not a personality or person. So Dennis, quickly before Gwen gives me the axe, how can we use this data in advocacy and in litigation? How should a PTA embrace it? Should they? Because I just don't want us to live in this one-off world where we're focused on a personality in a particular set of circumstances, and we're not attacking the institutional problem.
Yeah, I think you're right that we do have to recognize that at the root of all of these problems is both an institutional and a structural racism, discrimination that continues to have an effect on people of color. And I think the first and biggest thing is to face up to the existence of this, which again, we're very much a nation in denial. We talk about race, but we talk about race in an odd way. We see people like Donald Sterling and say, oh, look at that racist, he's horrible. I'm glad I'm not like him. There's something almost biblical about pointing out something and saying, oh, I'm glad I'm better than him. But the truth is that we all are victims and causes for these institutional and structural things. So that I think that we need to question why the distribution of kids in classes are the way they are. We need to look carefully at the discipline data and say, well, why is it that these kids are being punished more? Anthony spoke about in the context of the criminal law where there's no difference in fact that whites sell drugs more than black kids do, but you wouldn't know that by looking at the statistics. And I think we need to look at the statistics, face the disparities, go below them, and say, what is a way that we could address this? It's also a question of empathy, and I think you talked about Trayvon Martin and all of those other cases. And those, to me, I'm always amazed at the way that we discuss those and lose sight of the fact that these are children who are dying, who are being punished. And I don't know how much of it is that we have trouble putting ourselves, or very many of us have trouble putting ourselves in the place of these people who are victimized. But we need to recognize that they are all our children, that the future of the country depends on us working together, depends on everyone working to their ability and being given opportunities.
Well, more than half of all children born are minority children or mixed race children now. So we are moving to a minority-majority country very soon, and yet the power will remain in people's hands to rule that minority community as long as the stigmatization that goes on with preschool children all the way up to life without parole and the death penalty is allowed to flourish. So I think we have to stop here, and I just want to say, Anthony, thank you for putting that fabulous speech together and helping us bridge the gap, because now after we've talked about schools and we've talked about the criminal justice system, we can see how it's an unending kind of connecting the dots narrative for our children once they're stigmatized in school. So there are microphones on both of the steps, and I would like if the audience asks questions. And if you could say your name and identify your organization, I'd appreciate it.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Veronique Pluvios, and thank you for your work that you're doing and for so many around the room. I wanted to ask to what extent this challenge is in part over who has almost co-opted the conversation in terms of defining what the goals are for civil liberties and civil rights. And I raised two examples. One is in the area of education, where instead of us really focusing on words, fairness to access and quality education, legally, over a period of time, we've almost been forced to argue it legally in terms of the prize being diversity. And the diversity is really to benefit really how Black and brown kids operate in a majority white institution, so that the benefit of diversity is for the white kids as opposed to the overall goal of fairness, access, and those laudable goals. And then the other context I would provide is in the context of criminal justice, where the last couple of years I've been lobbied a lot by a lot of my friends and colleagues who wanted me to take a more vocal position on legalizing marijuana. And the big push was, you got to get on board because, so many people are going to jail. These Black and brown kids are going to jail for just carrying a nickel. Well, we used to call it nickel bag when I was little, younger. But I just couldn't understand, because I said, well, if that's your goal, then why aren't you addressing the fact that young people of color are locked up for crimes that I know that they're not committing at any greater rate, as opposed to you want to legalize a product, which can go either way. I'm not here to discuss pros or cons about the product, but it just seems to me that there's this huge movement now, states across states adopting ballots or through the legislative process, because now they're like, well, we need to legislate this, legalize to address the disparities in the criminal justice system, but why aren't we demanding that we just address the disparities in the criminal system? So I just thought perhaps if we could talk about who gets to basically dominate the discussion and what do we do about it.
Thank you, Veronique. If I could summarize what I think you're saying is, number one, the paradigm shift where we believe that you would get unequal education as long as there was segregation, from that point of view to the diversity discussion. And the second thing I heard is the focus on marijuana legalization as opposed to disparate sentencing practices. Would either of you care to address that?
Sure. I mean, you're speaking to the ACLU, so a pretty fundamental platform at the ACLU is that nobody should dominate the conversation, and that it's important to make sure that everyone has a voice. And so certainly my own litigation life, my own activist life has been, you use the tools that will actually achieve a win on behalf of your clients in court, and you use the tools that will actually achieve the greater equality that the legal tools provide for us. It's not my experience that we have had to put our arguments into a particular box in order to be able to succeed. It's been my experience that the Brown lawyers showed us that even when obstacles seem insurmountable, you can get past them if you're creative enough and if you have good enough proof. to be able to win. And so I think that's a good life lesson for us, and I think that none of us here as advocates should be feeling constrained about the ways that we can use our voice and advocate for the kinds of change that we want to see.
I mean, I do feel a little bit constrained by the law, and particularly, as it deals with, let's say, consideration of race and things like admissions to schools. And I agree 100% that the way that the issue has been framed by the Supreme Court has made it more difficult, so that it being presented as a question of a relatively few white people being disadvantaged by discrimination, when we saw what happened in Michigan when the proposition was passed, that the number of children of color, of students of color at the schools went down precipitously. Part of this is a question of framing. I don't think we've done as good a job of making it clear what's at stake, that there is a fundamental unfairness. It is true that starting actually with Bakke, we were forced to discuss the issue of higher education in the context of diversity. I think the biggest problem with that context is it ignores what I've been saying several times today, that there are still overwhelming racial problems that are not being addressed and are not even really being acknowledged. The basis for parents involved, the basis for the Fisher decision is always something different than the nature of the discrimination that still exists in this country.
Well, I heard Veronique say something a little different. I think that the message was inadvertently sent that all black education is inferior, and this has had a very harsh impact on historically black colleges who are suffering. So I heard something, and maybe I'm overinterpreting her question, but I heard something that said, this whole need to integrate has the unintended consequence of telling black children that they're only successful if they go and go to a diverse school, and they're only successful if they have gone through an integrated program. But I don't want to keep talking. Gentlemen, you've been standing there patiently for 5 minutes. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
My name is Ralph Buglis, just an interested citizen. You sort of took the wind out of my sails because I was going to ask about the Supreme Court. The Brown decision, of course, was unanimous, which made it a more powerful statement. I'm not sure that as the court is presently constituted, if you could go back in time, whether this court would be unanimous in a decision like Brown, in part, unfortunately, because of the only African-American member of the court. But that's a hypothetical. You can comment or not. But mostly I was just curious about where you think the Supreme Court is today relative to Brown as a really forceful statement and compared to some of their other rulings on racial discrimination in education.
You know what? I think I'll ask the panelists to choose one or the other to answer the question so that we can get to more people. So Dennis or Catherine?
Okay, I'll take it. My own view is that reading the Brown decision is among the best readings that any of us can ever do. It's a beautiful decision. It's beautifully written. It was shocking at the time. It's shocking today for the majesty of the language and the promise that's in it. And I don't read very many decisions that are like that today from the Supreme Court or in the past 60 years from the Supreme Court. It almost stands alone. So, I'm not a good prognosticator, but I don't anticipate that we will see more decisions that are that pleasurable to read in the near term. I have to say, in 1954, had I been alive and had I been a prognosticator, I would not have predicted that decision. So, it really does sort of stand alone. And there's an interesting history that got us to that unanimous decision then, right? And it would be nice to find ourselves in that moment again going forward. But I don't think it's on our near-term horizon.
Thank you. Sir, if you would introduce yourself and ask your question.
Reverend Dr. Earl Trent from pastor of Florida Avenue Baptist Church here in Washington, D.C. We've been talking about Brown versus the Board of Education and some of the unintended consequences, the overreach with zero tolerance. My question that either one of the panelists can respond to is when we look at Brown versus Board of Education, one of the responses, almost immediate responses, was the formation of private academies to not enforce Brown versus Board of Education. Today we have the charter school movement, which has taken off in some unintended ways. Within that context, looking at the charter school movement, which is taking public money, putting it in private hands, which personally I see as an outgrowth of these private academies, but it has been embraced. It has been embraced by many states, some unwillingly, like Washington, D.C., which was forced upon because we didn't have representation, we don't have vote, and we don't have statehood. Those of you from D.C., you know what I'm talking about. So if you would just respond within that context, as we see the charter school movement in light of Brown versus Board of Education and the history and the consequences of the unintended consequences of some of the overreach that we're seeing today.
Putting aside the questions of funding that are associated with charter schools, the questions of school structure, of the role of teachers, just putting aside all of those for a second, I would say this. I mean, it does seem like it's a train that's going to be hard to stop, even if we wanted to, and I'm not going to offer an opinion on that. But it is also possible that charter schools, like every other public school, could conceivably be ways of furthering the goals of Brown. And there have been some that have been successful, much in the way that magnet schools can be devices that further desegregation. And it really depends on the individual states, on the individual school districts, making sure that that isn't left out of the equation, that we don't create things that are going to isolate children more, that are going to expose them to fewer resources, that they be the engines of opportunity that we were told they would be in the beginning. But I think that that can be done.
Ms. Humphrey.
Well, my name is Kim Humphrey. I'm with the ACLU. And my question is going back to the issue of discrimination broadly and desegregation or segregation. So when you talked about segregation or desegregation of communities and of schools as a choice, it makes me wonder how we fight against that, especially coming from a place like the ACLU where we fight for your right to have your choice and be able to do whatever you want to do and not have anyone question that. So how do we message to communities that the choice should be integration?
So in my 10 years at the ACLU, the choice that we fought for was a choice that was still legal. So there are some constraints even within the ACLU on the fight for choice. But so I don't think that's changed. But in addition, the way that we fight for integration is the way that we fight for every other civil right, right? I mean, we need to demonstrate its value. We need to be vigilant about it. We need to be fighting every day to say that this is what we expect for our kids, this is what we need for our kids, and this is why. And just not accepting of the kinds of disparities that the data that we've talked about show, not accepting of the kinds of differential offerings that we're seeing in too many places around the country. And so it's dismaying that fight is still a fight, but we have to keep fighting it.
And I guess, what are we doing? What are we doing to do that? That would be my last.
So maybe Dennis and I can both talk about that, because I think there's certainly things that we're doing in the federal government, and I know there's things that the ACLU is doing as well, and I think it's probably valuable to highlight both. But within the federal government, we're fighting on lots of fronts. In fact, just yesterday, speaking back to the charter school question, my office put out guidance about the obligation of charter schools to satisfy our federal civil rights laws. And so as there is a proliferation of charter schools about which we're very enthusiastic, we think that they can serve a very important need, but we want to make sure that those schools, like every other public school, satisfy their civil rights obligations, and we wanted to send a message that's critically important. We are putting out data about the disparities. We are responding to that data. My office receives in excess of 10,000 complaints a year, We have 3,000 pending investigations just right now. We are closing them. We are closing them as quickly as we can. We are engaging in robust resolutions where we are dramatically changing the life circumstances of kids in schools that are segregated today, that have segregated offerings in their schools. And there are sort of appalling variety of the kinds of things that we see on those fronts, but an inspiring, I think, variety of kinds of resolutions that we can achieve so that we can actually send a message to the schools and the districts that we're investigating, but to others that are like them also, that we're serious, that the law needs to be enforced, and that we will do it. So that's certainly the role of the federal government, and I know that there's more that others, including at the ACLU, are doing.
Yeah, and I think that our cases are again, mostly designed to assure that all students have an opportunity. There are some instances where I would not support choice, and maybe Anthony will fire me after this, but you can't choose to exclude a disabled student. You can't choose to exclude, and even if that would be your preference, the law doesn't permit that. And it's important for us as an organization and us as a country to assure that there is inclusion of everyone. We have a case which we've been litigating for 25 years now in Hartford, Connecticut, that's based on the idea that if you create meaningful choice in terms of magnet schools, in terms of interdistrict transfers, in terms of programs, that you can create really high quality integrated schools. And some of these schools, more than 40 magnet schools over the past 10 or 15 years have been created. Many of them have been named blue ribbon schools in the country. And they're a good example. They have kids not only in the 96% black and Latino Hartford schools going to them, but kids from some of the wealthiest white suburbs in Connecticut wanting to go to the Montessori school or ones like that. So there are ways that you can use choice, just like charters, to achieve diversity and to make it possible for all students to have opportunity. And so our cases are making sure that kids aren't pushed out of schools.
Thanks, Dennis. Madam Principal.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Beverly Hutton, and I'm representing the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and so happy to be here. And having been a high school principal myself, I can clearly say that school principals are responsible for the culture and climate of the building, and the OCR report and the data was refreshing because it certainly wasn't new information to those of us who've been in the field, but it has elevated the conversation so that we're forced to address the issue, which is a good thing. But my comment is really about preparation for principals and teachers, et cetera, and that I can't remember there being something in a program around cultural competencies and understanding people who are different and addressing this issue of implicit biases. These are very difficult conversations to have, and people need to be trained to do that. And I think that the guidance that comes out needs to address that and force that issue as well. I also, having been involved in the supportive school discipline reports, et cetera, we need information in education. There is an education gap for school leaders and teachers, and information on how to address this issue without immediately employing exclusionary discipline practices. Right. And then the resources to keep kids in school while providing the kinds of counseling and learning that's needed about the schooling experience, about how to respond appropriately, and all of that. That needs to be a part of the guidance as well. Because what we can't do in schools is say, you have to do this. This is another federal mandate that's not, with no resources to do it. Right. We want to do it. We recognize that there are disparities. We recognize that something needs to be done. But in the guidance from the federal government, there needs to be some guidance about cultural competencies, a requirement about cultural competencies, a requirement for preparation programs to address it, and then the resources to do so in the school environment as well.
Thank you. I think that's just such a terrific point to make sure that at the same time that we say what the law is and what we will do when there's non-compliance with the law, that we also make sure that we share information about what alternatives are and ways to satisfy the law are. And I will say that you are unusual in your request for a federal requirement, but I so welcome it. I will take that back to my office.
So, Gwen, how much time do we have? We're good? Okay. Sir, if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Bill Pritchett. I'm the Director of Organizational Equity at the Service Employees International Union. And first, I'd just like to say thank you very much for a really great conversation about a really important topic that doesn't get discussed often enough. And then I'd also like to say that the comment that I was going to raise, or the question that I have, was beautifully articulated, or part of it, by the sister who just spoke, because as you all were talking about some of the finer points of the school-to-prison pipeline and the inequitable system that a lot of our children of color unfortunately have to still endure these days, I was reminded of Neil Tyson, the host of Cosmos and the astrophysicist, in a recent discussion similar to the one that you're having here, where he was asked a question about, how discrimination was manifesting itself these days, or if it was. And he spoke about the way in which when he came up through his educational curricula and matriculation, that he would constantly run into guidance counselors and teachers who, when he said he aspired to be an astrophysicist, told him, oh, you shouldn't think about that, you should think about something that's more realistic. Steered him towards sports, baseball, basketball, football, etc. And the question that I really would like to just say amen to and ask you to speak a little bit more about goes to what the sister just raised and what the sister earlier was speaking about when she asked, and what I got out of it, how do we go from beyond diversity to equity, to having a conversation about multicultural competence among the teachers and the administrators in schools, and what in the OCR data, perhaps, are there any recommendations that are included with that data, first and foremost, and are there any recommendations from the ACLU that specifically speak to what we need to do differently to increase the level of equity competence among principals and administrators? And if there aren't recommendations in the reports, it'd also be great to hear just the top 3 or 5 that you may have off the top of your head.
Great, thank you. So the data itself is data, and it doesn't include recommendations or prescriptions. It's a picture, really, a snapshot of what we see. We hope and expect that people will use the data to then take a look at whether there's something more that needs to be done. And all too often, where there are extreme disparities, a cultural competence issue is one of the key drivers for change. And so when we investigate and we determine that A, there is a disparity, and B, that disparity is supported by unlawful behaviors, and so that something needs to be changed, then we do often require retraining at the school district for staff, sometimes for students, sometimes for both, to respond to the kinds of inequities. And we have put up our resolution agreements on our website so that people can see the kinds of changes that we do expect. And when we look underneath the data, when we see real disparities of the kinds that Laura has described that are in the data, Black kids are 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than white kids. Then we take a look at what caused the suspension, who meted it out, who made the decision, and what was underneath those decisions. And we find things that are disturbing, right? I mean, we'll see 2 11th graders who committed the same offense, but who received very, very different penalties for the same offense. So, a white 11th grader who, this is an example, they aren't even 2 11th graders. A white 11th grader pulled a fire alarm and received in-school suspension, but a black kindergartner who pulled the same fire alarm was suspended from school for multiple days. I mean, we're not seeing the same kinds of discipline meted out. And so then, when we're working in a district at that time, then we say you need to have somebody come in and do training for you about bias, cultural bias, and cultural competence, and make sure that you're making different decisions going forward. So for us, it's not in the data, but it is in our practices, in our enforcement work.
I mean, one of the things, if I could just really briefly address that, we're most known for litigation, but we are also involved in education and in bringing issues out. So, for example, we've been looking extensively at the question of the role that police play in schools. And we've noted the huge increase in the number of referrals to police, but we went further and then made specific recommendations for school districts. We have a white paper guidance that says, think about training, think about having clear instructions to a school resource officer or a police officer saying, this is when you intervene, this is when you don't. Think about who has ultimate authority about what goes on in the schools. Because what we found when we went to a number of school districts and said, how do you use police in schools, that it was random, that there were no set of rules, that it wasn't thought out, it wasn't clear whether the principal was in control or the police department, it wasn't clear whether the police should be enforcing non-criminal offenses like dress code violations, and all of those create an environment that make it possible for the numbers that we see to happen. So I think for each of the issues, there has to be training, and you know, the one thing I keep returning to, there has to be a recognition that there's a problem.
I just want to add one quick note that just like with the war on drugs that flooded our communities with anti-DEA agents and anti-drug police forces, special units, I think our school systems are being flooded with school resource officers from the federal government, and we have been working hard to try to change the orientation of those officers so they don't have to be police, but we need to follow the money, and the money is, after Newtown especially, the shooting there, the money is in putting police in school, and it's a growth industry for police officers. So we've got to, just like with the war on drugs, we've got to follow the money. Would you introduce yourself, madam?
Yeah, my name is Pat Ford, and I'm the former Executive Vice President of the Service Employees International Union, and I also serve on the board of the Congressional Black Caucus Institute under the leadership of Congressman Benny Thompson. I actually want to go back a little bit before your panel to the incarceration, to the jail piece of it. In the context of privatization of prisons, and the fact that that is big business. I mean, I was at an event that actually talked about privatization of prisons is on Wall Street. You can invest in this. So how do you address that in the context of this discussion and the fact that they look at our children from the 3rd grade to determine what the prison population is? Now you got the privatization that has a quota that means that they have to then fill it in order to do that. And how do we look at that in the context of this this discussion?
Well, I think the ACLU, I know the ACLU opposes the privatization of prisons. We're seeing a huge growth spurt in the number of private prisons used to enforce immigration laws. And, you know, we think it's frankly sickening that these prisons are allowed to operate and you can't do Freedom of Information Act requests. They don't fall under some of the federal legislation that that offers guidance to prisons. The prisoners don't have the same rights. Sometimes they're left in horrific conditions and underfed, getting 2 meals instead of 3 meals a day. I mean, Anthony has gone to the LA County Prison, which is a public prison, but you know, we've got a whole project devoted to prison litigation, and I just think that you're right to point it out. And I think we ought to think about maybe a social movement around it, because it's like companies that invested in South Africa. Until the people rose up and said, we don't want our resources invested in apartheid, you know, we couldn't, we had no influence. But I think that this is I'm not saying that officially as an ACLU policy. I'm just saying that as an observer of social movements, that it might take something like that to get us off this addiction to private prisons, this growing addiction.
Well, when you think about the schools, when you talk about from schools to prisons and that pipeline to that, I think we have to look at it in the context of that, since the majority of the people in prison are what, for plea bargain because of lack economics and that kind of thing, and they're threatening of putting their mothers, their children in foster homes, their wives in jail, taking their parents' properties, and that they plea bargain to do those things. So there's this connection that I don't think we can look at this issue separately. We may not be able to do much on the end of it, but we need to look at it as a total picture in order to address it.
Yeah, I
Thank
agree
you so
completely.
much.
One way that we've done that is we actually had a case in Atlanta against an alternative school that was run by a private company that was associated with the Corrections Corporation of America. And they actually ran this alternative school literally like you would a prison. Every student had to go through a metal detector, had to be wanded. Female students had to lift their bras to show that they didn't have any guns or drugs. And the students were treated from the beginning of the day to the end of the day like prisoners. They were not given educational opportunities. And as a result of that case, Atlanta severed its relationship with that company. And I think that that's something that we have to be very, very vigilant, because there's a lot of pressure to prioritize a lot of different sections of public life. And I think that we do that, as you point out, to the detriment of large parts of our population. So we have to be really vigilant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gwen, how are we doing? Can we take one more question? Or even two, okay.
Great. Good afternoon. I'd like to first thank you all for this panel, and I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to thank you for giving him some tickets. My name is Cherry Jeter, and I am a native Washingtonian like the gentleman over there, and I work in a charter school. I am a school administrator and a special education coordinator. I've worked in alternative schools. I'm a teacher, so this issue is very dear to my heart. In fact, I'm submitting an application for my own charter school next year. What I would say is, first of all, I feel like charter schools, they do offer opportunities for schools to diversify and have different types of students. I went to DC Public Schools, and I went to an all-black school. I sent my son to a school that was predominantly a white school, and we were just having a conversation about how, kids that are the only black kids in the school, how that makes them feel, and how sometimes, you mean well for them and you want them to have this awesome education, but it kind of backfires on you. So in the charter school community, you get a bunch of different schools from, different parts of the city. A bunch of different children from different parts of the city, and then you're able to put them all together, and some offer quality educations, some don't. I've worked in schools that are great, and I've worked in schools that are not so great. But what I would say is, what do you do when you come from maybe a different train of thought, you're the next generation in education, you feel like you know what kids need, you've worked around them long enough, but the authorities, the chartering authorities, the people who are the ones who grant you permission to work with these children, they're more traditional in their mindset. That's how you end up with the same school over and over again. That's how you end up with not a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, and you kind of get to a place where you just feel like, once you can't get through the door. You can't even get the opportunity to educate the kids in the ways that you think benefit them, the ways that you've seen work firsthand because you're on the front lines every day. You just kind of get the red tape. We live in a very political city, and so if you don't, do that well, then, you're kind of stuck behind the door.
Is your question really about how do we modernize our thinking?
About how exactly, if the powers that be, they don't see things the way you see them because it's uncomfortable for them, because, we haven't seen it before, because, you will see things in private schools that maybe you want to try in the public school setting, but they don't feel comfortable giving you that public money because that's not what they are used to. How do you kind of push past that? And, because it's like you said, it's about a frame of mind more than, even them just feeling like, we don't want you here, we don't want you. I don't understand what what it is that you want. So, I just feel like, you just feel stuck at some point, and then you're in this kind of middle position where you can help these few kids here and there, but, you're not the person who makes the decisions, and so you kind of just feel, lost.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the guidance that the principal was asking for. I mean, there are many players in schools. It's not just the principal, it's not just the police officer, but there are people in middle management in schools who want to have a voice and who want to change the environment they're in. Are there any suggestions that you could give the questioner, Assistant Secretary?
Sure. So I think it's really exciting that you're thinking about putting in an application for your own school next year. And obviously the charter school system has really taken off in Washington, D.C. It's about half the schools that are here in Washington, D.C. now. So I think it's really exciting that you're thinking about creating a new school. And I hear your frustration about, or worry about whether your ideas will actually come to fruition. And certainly within the federal government, we have an Office for Innovation and Improvement that tries to seed the kinds of ideas that you're describing for making sure that charter schools and traditional public schools do have non-traditional ideas for ways to deliver for our kids and that are exciting and that can be proof points for what work around the country. And so it's certainly something that within that office they look for. My office works together with that office for the Magnet Schools Assistance Program grants, where we are granting magnet schools to create those same kinds of ideas also. So we are looking for innovations and improvement. And I don't know your specific ideas, so I wish you luck for your school, but there are ways that we are funding, that we are inviting, that we are putting out guidance about the generation of those kinds of ideas and their creation all over the country. So I do think it's really exciting.
So that's, would that be like for a public school, like a magnet school? So like,
Yes.
like to take over a public school to become a magnet school? Is that what the funding?
Sure, or to create a new magnet school also, but yes, and that it also applies the Office for Innovation and Improvement. I'm not as involved in this, but the Office for Innovation and Improvement also funds charter schools as charter schools independent of the magnet question.
Oh, okay, good information. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Dennis, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, not to that question. I think that summed it up.
All right. One other thing that I wanted to raise, even though today's focus is on Brown and people think of Brown as a black and white issue, the Latino community is facing the school to deportation pipeline, where kids, ICE officers come to public schools and they surround the school and they stop kids leaving and going into the school. They stop their parents. Is there anything that the Office of Civil Rights is doing to look at that problem?
Sure. We look at discrimination in every form, so that problem and any other, we are interested and open for business to try to address. But in some recent areas that we've worked in, like issues, we just put out guidance about the Supreme Court's decision in Plyler 30 years ago, guaranteeing that anybody, documented or not, should be able to enroll in school and should be served at school. And so the new guidance just reiterates that schools should not be asking for students or their parents' documentation status, should not be requiring, for example, that parents provide Social Security numbers or driver's licenses as ways of proving residence within the district, that there are alternative ways that families can prove residence within a district or age of a student. And we were pretty expansive in the ways that we highlight that districts could accept, including using a family Bible to identify a student's age. And so, we really wanted to be very, very clear that what the Supreme Court said 30 years ago is the law today, that all of our students should be able to enroll in school. And we've also recently put out, completed a resolution in a district that had created a hostile environment for Latino students and Latino staff, so that they were made to feel unwelcome and they were regularly harassed by the district administration. And that has now ended as a result of that resolution agreement. In Cleveland, we entered into a resolution agreement where the district was failing to identify and advertise the STEM courses that they offer. They're really exciting STEM courses available for students in some schools that are focused on STEM, where in one of the schools the kids got to watch live surgeries as part of their classroom experience, which is very far from my own high school experience, I will say. So very, very, very exciting opportunities for kids, but they weren't advertising their availability to the limited English proficient families in the district. And so there were seats that were going untaken in this district for these really exciting schools because families didn't know that they could send their kids and that the schools would serve their kids if they were there. So that has changed. And so we see a variety of ways in which discrimination is rearing its ugly head, and we're here to beat it back.
Well, I just want to say, because I am a lobbyist, that we would love to work with you on this issue. We would
Thank
love
you.
to have your agency work with the Department of Homeland Security about its enforcement practices outside of schools. So that's a very important issue. But Dennis, you look like you had a thought that you wanted to complete on one of the questions. Did I?
No, it was really more of a summary thought.
All right,
We'll
okay,
get to
well,
that.
we'll get to that, but I have one more question, too. We think of diversity and desegregation now in much broader terms, Black, Latino, but also kids with disability.
That's right.
And the LGBT community. You just recently said that Title IX prevents discrimination against transgendered students. Are you planning to come out with guidance on that?
Well, we hope to, so stay tuned. That would be really nice. But we thought it was an important first step to be able to say that Title IX does cover, Title IX is the federal sex discrimination law, that it does cover gender identity and gender expression as well. And you know, it's obviously been an area in which we've been active in our enforcement, and it's an area that will continue, and we wanted to make clear that our transgender students, like all of our students, deserve to be protected at school.
Well, I just wouldn't have my lobbying credentials if I didn't throw in two questions like that, but thank you for that. I'd like to give both of you an opportunity to go back to the 60,000-foot view about where we've come in the last 60 years and give us and the audience an imperative, a to-do list or a challenge about what we need to do to make equality real in public education and what we need to do to complete the vision of Brown in terms of what it means to a free society.
Sure, thanks, Laura. I really think the title of this discussion is really right. I mean, it is equality within our grasp. If we think it's not, we have no business being here, right? It is in our grasp. We have to be fighting for it, and that's something that each of us should be struggling for. I'm so grateful as a civil rights lawyer, now as a civil rights enforcer, I'm so grateful to have the tools that the Brown Court gave us, that the Brown litigators showed us, to be following in the path of really visionary litigators who did not take no for an answer and who said, we can change this, we can do better, we can deliver more. It's an inspiration for me every day to think about what I can do that will follow in that path and deliver for kids. But it's also enormously distressing to me the variety of ways that segregation, that civil rights violations persist in our schools and persist for our kids across so many dimensions. And I see the data about it, my own data. I see the stories in the complaints that come into our office, and some of them are jaw-dropping to me. That there are fact patterns that I could never have predicted, that would never have thought would be happening in schools. And then there are others that are so painfully familiar, and I can't believe that they persist, and I'm so distressed that they do. So the sheer variety and volume of the work is extreme. Stick your finger in the dike anywhere that you're ready, because there's somebody's baby who deserves your help. There's somebody's child whose life will be changed, whose life trajectory will be changed because you stood up for that child, and it's the right thing to do. So I'm so pleased and grateful to have the opportunity to do it, and would love to have you on the team doing it with us, filing complaints with our office, going and advocating with your district, going and mentoring a kid. Standing up for another kid's life opportunity. There are so many different ways that we can be there for that change, and I'd love to have you on the team doing it with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dennis.
I've been reading a lot about this observation of the 60th anniversary, and you see the question frequently about whether or not Brown was a failure or whether it was a success. And for me, there's no question. Brown was not only a success, it was one of the biggest successes in the history of our country. And the people who struggled to realize Brown, the people who fought to make it a reality, the people who recognized the importance of Brown, did what they were supposed to do. They were successful. And if there's been a failure in the time, it's because we have gotten complacent. We have not remembered the spirit of Brown, the things that it stood for. We have accepted things that we shouldn't accept, that people before us fought, sometimes literally lost their lives fighting for, and we have become somewhat complacent. All of the problems that Catherine have described are serious problems, and they're problems of the United States. They're not problems of Latino kids or black kids. It's the nation's problem. And we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our children, we owe it to the country as a whole to take a serious searching look at the continuing disparities, to recognize what is unfair, and to address that, and to do it by every way we can, whether it's as we do by lawsuits, by educating people, by making sure that all of the promises of equality that education promises can be realized. And I join Catherine in urging everyone to recognize that this is a problem for all of us and we need to face up to it squarely.
Please give a round of applause to our brilliant panelists. We are so honored by your presence. I can't thank you enough, and by the pearls of wisdom that you've shared with us today. So my mission was to get us out of here by 2 o'clock, so mission accomplished. But before you go, I would like to encourage you to tweet about this program and include @ACLU or go to our website, aclu.org. And we have a whole lot of offerings, thanks to our tremendous communications department led by Emily Tynes, about Brown. So if you want to learn more about the decision, please go to our website. I also am deeply grateful to the National Archives for allowing us to use this tremendous space, and also to the Afro-American Historical Society for allowing us to convene. Because if they did not co-sponsor this event, we wouldn't be here. And again, to the Afro-American newspapers, and also to Alelia Bundles, who has pushed for more integrated programs at the National Archives in her capacity as chair of the Archives Foundation Board. So thank you all for attending, and be safe. And we have sign-up sheets, or we'll collect business cards if you want to stay in touch and receive action alerts about what the ACLU is doing in this and other areas. So thank you.